I just want to say that I had trouble joining, that I used the link.
Good evening, Ms. Westerdahl. There was some technical issues on my end with my home Wi-Fi, so there was nothing wrong with the password or the link. Thank you.
Oh, well, I just want to say I used a different link. I used the one in the, instead of in the one that was in the main, I used the one on the document.
Yeah, but the
And
issue wasn't with the link. It was actually with me accessing the meeting with my Optimum Wi-Fi, which I was having an issue with. But thank you.
All right, great. I'm glad we're all here now.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, good evening, Suki. So sorry for the delay. Victim of Optimum this evening. My apologies.
Not at all. Just to warn you guys, I don't know if there's anybody else who's trying to get on, but the link that was emailed out doesn't work. I had to go through the link that's on the website. So if you know anyone who's trying to get on, just let them know.
Okay, got it. Okay, I'm gonna live stream as well on the Facebook page.
Yeah, that's the problem I had as well.
Do you have John Craver's phone number? I think we should probably let him know.
Oh, John actually sent an email that his son was ill, so he was not sure if he would be able to make it.
Okay. So I just got a message from Esteban saying I clicked on the link and I think it sent me to the wrong meeting because I didn't recognize anyone in there. Should I tell him to try?
Yeah, tell Esteban to check his email right now. I'm gonna send him an updated link. Thank you.
It's also live on I don't know if you can hear me. It's live on, I just got a notification that it's live on the YouTube channel as well now.
Okay. And you know, I tried to email this to Alicia as well, but I don't seem to have the right email for her.
Yeah, well, everybody's got the wrong.
So we'll just let's wait 5 minutes because there's obviously issues. Did you guys have a chance to read the articles that I sent out about the peaker plant and the installation on the roof for that Williamsburg building?
I read them.
Okay, awesome.
I used to live right there, so.
Oh, wow.
For a long time, so I'm familiar with that area. Yeah, I read, I saw the people that were testifying. I think I may even know somebody who lives there, but I'm not sure anymore.
Oh, hi, Esteban.
Suki, this is John Wolfling. I'm coming a little late to the game. I didn't get those articles.
Hi, John. I'll send them to you. I'm not sure if I have your email address, but I know I have your wife's email address.
Yes.
So actually it's great that you're on because you can talk to us about solar panels.
Yep.
So it's too bad John is not here. He was going to do some research for us, but I took a look at the code last night and it's not saying quite what city planning was saying that it said.
Which code? The fire department code or the building code?
The zoning
resolution. Okay, zoning.
Yeah, because
I call it the zoning resolution. So, but okay, yep.
Right. So the issue here, just since you haven't been on, is the city is putting forward zoning text amendments.
Yep. I'm actually very familiar with them. So
right, and so the one part of it is the zoning for zero carbon.
Yep.
And they haven't given out a lot of specifics yet, but in the 2 public information sessions that they held, one of the things that they were suggesting was that they would like to change the zoning to allow for greater solar rooftop coverage.
Yep.
And they said that you could only have 25% coverage, and there was a height limit and so on.
Yep.
So I just took a look at the code last night, and it's too bad John's not here and Andrew's not here, because I sent this to them as well, but maybe since you're an architect and you have solar panels, we can talk
Yep.
about this. There actually is no percentage limit in the code as I see it on rooftop solar. The only restriction, if you look at the permitted obstructions in open space, it looks like the only restriction is on height. It's up to 10 feet in R1 through R5 and 15 feet in R6 through R10. And then you can't take up more than 25% of required open space, but a rooftop is not typically required open space. Typically that would be a backyard, a courtyard, something like that, right? It can function as required open space if it's like one of those buildings that has the first floor almost fully built out and the tenants above they're counting that first floor roof. But that's not the typical situation. Right. So it's.
Well, so, I admire your fortitude to get into the zoning resolution. It is a 1,000-page document, so the 25%, I will try to find that. I know it's in there. I know it's buried in some place that is probably counterintuitive, but I know it's in there because I've had my projects limited by that.
Okay.
That we've only been able to do 25% roof coverage or of the lot coverage of the site is limited. Sorry, the lot coverage of the site
Right.
can't exceed the 25% of that value. So it is a real limitation. And I think as a city and as a state where we are trying to advocate for sustainable design and more distributed solar and better resiliency within the grid, this text change amendment makes a lot of sense.
Right. So I would be very surprised because I know you guys are my backyard neighbors. So I know I'm pretty sure your solar panels are more than 25% coverage. I have another neighbor who has panels. It's more than 25% coverage.
Are you going to drop a dime on me?
No, of course not. I don't think it's contrary to the code.
It is. And I'll find the reference and
okay, it might be a fire code issue. I don't know if the
there's
fire
separate
department is saying.
there's separate fire department requirements that require access paths. It depends on the slope of the roof, but there's pathways, there's landing
Right.
areas that need to be kept clear for the fire department to service a fire. There was a recent city council bill that was trying to reduce that from 4 feet to 3 feet on I think lower density buildings
Right.
and then 5 or 6 feet to 5 feet on higher density buildings.
Right. Which is still an awful lot.
Still an awful lot. You're right. I mean, I really see that as nibbling about the edges. So I think this 25% flexibility would be a much more meaningful change.
Right. Yeah, I think actually it's really important that tell me what you find in the code, but if neither of us finds anything definitive, I think this is something that
I know it's in there.
Be planning about.
I know it's in there.
It could also be a buildings. Is it a buildings department?
It's a zoning thing. It's part of the zone green amendments that were made a couple years ago. Well, more than a couple years ago, but it's in there.
Okay. Because under permitted obstructions for open space, it's very clear that it's not. They're really only talking about the height issue. I don't know, Andrew.
I'll find it.
Andrew, did you have an opinion on that?
Sorry, I wasn't able to do my upcodes research, but
Okay.
are you
Use
referring to
upcodes too. Good for you.
Okay.
But are you referring to the local laws like 92 through 94 about the usage of green, wet, and
No. We're
reflective
talking
roofs?
about the solar panel rooftop coverage limits.
Oh yeah.
Is that
That I think that I haven't experienced that on anything I've worked on, but I assume like if it's been presented to the Department of Buildings, they request variances multiple times and it's a real issue. I don't know. Sorry.
Okay. The other thing, John, I wonder is like if you're working on I know that the ZQA amendments
Yep.
changed the open space and lot coverage requirements for affordable housing buildings, right? So you can now have buildings that literally have 100% lot coverage if it's a corner building.
On corner lots, yeah.
Right. So
But that's not affordable. It's any building. Any building can have 100% lot, any
Right,
residential
so-
building can have 100% lot
So
coverage at the
in,
corner.
under those circumstances, I don't know if either the zoning resolution or the multiple dwelling law or something would want to count rooftop space as required open space. I mean, to me, it's actually a practical issue because like during the pandemic, I had neighbors in pre-war buildings where they don't have, they're not built to that, 30-foot backyard, 65% lot coverage, new code, and they have very, very small open spaces or courtyards. And, they wanted more open space in and around their buildings. So some of them started thinking about using the rooftops
Yep.
as gardens. And so this does become an issue of, are we going to promote solar panels and batteries on rooftops? Are we going to promote recreation and green roofs, right? And, maybe it becomes a consideration how much other open space there is. So I'll stop now and
So I think, you bring up a good point. I think flexibility for this 25% coverage would allow building owners and tenants to have more flexibility. They could either choose to do solar rooftop in excess of the 25%. There's nothing that prohibits them now from using those from programming those rooftops unless there's like not sufficient egress or control and access issues. So I don't see those two things as competing. I see them as, there's choices out there, and every building owner and set of tenants get to make choices. So I don't see that it's contrary to providing open space. I mean, I think rooftop open space is maybe not feasible or practical in some buildings, like if you don't have sufficient egress, if there's not safety railings or fall protection. So I don't know, it is a complicated issue. I don't think as a community board it would make sense to resist this flexibility that this amendment is trying to do for that open space issue, which I think is you bring up a real issue given COVID, but I think the flexibility that comes with this change is on balance a good thing.
okay. Any other opinions about open space on buildings in our district? Rooftop coverage? Esteban, Andrew?
Sorry, again.
We can't hear you too
Did
well.
you guys talk about like batteries, solar? Sorry about that.
So we're actually discussing this issue of open space and rooftop space, and what do we want to use the rooftops for? Because potentially we could cover them with solar panels, we could have battery installations, we could have green roofs.
Yes.
If you live in an apartment building, what do you think?
My follow-up questions are, number one, I'm not sure if you're trying to make this out to be like a zero-sum game, like the roof has to be used for open space or it can be used for, I guess, energy production purposes. Like, have you guys talked about dunnage and the addition of battery or PV panels or PV arrays, or I guess anything else in relating to older buildings and renovations? And the second question I would have is like, is there, I saw there's a newly designated LPC historic district in our area.
Mhm.
So that got me thinking about like, how does LPC landmarks in general regulate open space and rooftop spaces as part of the character of the architectural fabric? I don't have an answer to that. I'd be curious to know.
Well, John, maybe you
Since
can
that-
tell us about that, since you have solar panels in a landmark district.
It was a real hassle to get through the landmarks process. It was probably one of the longest portions of the process. Having to go to them, make a submission, and it really was, thankfully, both my wife and I are architects, and we know the process, and we could assemble those drawings ourselves at low cost. It was our time, but so it's another barrier to implementation, another bit of red tape that I think inhibits a more inclusive and broad adoption of on-site renewable power. And also, I feel strongly that solar panels are really, there's so many benefits to them. When you're producing power on site, the electricity that you're using has basically zero transmission losses. When there is a power plant that's in upstate New York and that electricity has to travel down to us, there's basically like a 1/3 or a 2/3 loss. So for every kilowatt hour that I use here that's produced upstate, 3 kilowatt hours have to be produced. So because of those transmission losses, it makes so much more sense to do local production, local renewable power production, and use it at the site, right where it's being produced. And if I'm overproducing, let's say in June, and we're not here, we're away, my neighbors get to benefit from that power that I'm pushing into the grid, and is basically going right through the street infrastructure and going into their feeder, into their house. So it's reducing that transmission loss if I overproduce. So I think the more distributed local solar power that we can have in our neighborhoods, whether somebody can undertake that, landmarks commission filing, or they have to hire somebody else, or maybe there's a little bit more relaxation of that stringency and that regulatory hurdle. To me, I think we should be making strides to make it easier to do solar, to do on-site renewable. I don't know if anyone on this call has
Well,
strong
John, can
opinion.
you just quickly tell us, like,
Yeah.
what's the general rule with landmarks and solar panels? There's kind of like a standard, right?
Right. So you should not be able to see them from the street. If your house is in a landmark district, they don't want to have these solar panels be visible, which is, really difficult to do. I mean, you can see my solar panels. I had to go through a whole process. I had to mock them up at the back of my house, and make a real, I had to plead to get them done. And landmarks really put me through the ringer on this. Thankfully, I was successful in getting them, but there were like tweaks and refinements that we had to do to get them on the roof. So it is a real impediment to a more broad application. I mean, this is completely separate from this zoning amendments proposal, but it's an issue.
Teresa,
Yeah, I just, we've been trying to get solar. We have a flat roof. We have our own house, and we've been trying to get solar for quite some time, even very, very recently. And it's with the new regulations and the extra barriers we have to put up, and there's a new type of solar now that it's quite expensive. And even like we've went through to get the loan and everything. We've been working on it for a while, I would say a couple of years. And it's excessively expensive. It's more than $60,000 to get the, you know, a roof like we would want. You know, we could produce quite a lot with our roof, quite a lot of energy. And even with like bringing it down, the size, like it depends on how many panels you put up. And we want a elevated roof so we could have like, you know, it overhead, so we can be up there on the roof and be underneath in the shade. And we aren't able to do it. I mean, I don't know, some things got to change because we have a lot of neighbors with similar roofs, and we've talked to people like in Pilgia. We know a couple of families that have gotten them few years ago. And so we've been really working on it. And I just want to say that I know a lot of people would switch if it were affordable,
Less hard,
you know.
less hard too.
Yeah, well, we've gone through the whole process and we could get it. We've had it measured, everything. So we could get it, but it just turns out that that's like, it's just not viable, you know, for when you figure out like how much electricity you're getting per, you know, how much you're paying, it doesn't work out, you know, it doesn't work out. It just doesn't. I've sent information, like I'm on some forums with some other people that are, you know, big into solar, and I have a friend that has a company that moved to California though to just solar installation roofs, and she's like agrees with me that for New York it's not, I don't know, if there's a way we can get it to be, it would be wonderful.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there was an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning talking about the shortage of electricians who are going to be needed to do all of these installations, whether it's for solar panels or heat pumps or whatever. And, you know, the cost of labor, I think I talked about this last time, the lack of labor and the cost of labor is a big issue, both in New York City and elsewhere. And, you know, hopefully the city, as well as other levels of government, are going to step up on job training, you know, for these.
Yeah, my friend left, you know, the living situation, the amount of money she can make there is so much more than here.
Can I ask
Sorry.
Suki, I
a
was,
question?
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I'm thinking about what Teresa said earlier about just generally the hardship faced on individual, I guess, in this case, property owners, but it could be a co-op or something else. In my mind, it seems like when the regulations are so strict and so, you know, penalizing for people who want to do this, it makes an environment where private companies are able to like lease out people's rooftops, which is something I think we are largely against. You know, from the tenor and tone of this conversation previously, I think that having all of these really antiquated and kind of, you know, hard ships on people makes it so that it's like a more niche regulatory environment that specific companies are able to step in and act. And for a true like DG system that was being described earlier, that's really not the goal, and it's not in line with the way that I have seen people talk about how they like their houses in their neighborhood. I don't know if that's the correct way to think about that. It seems like that's what you've been showing us in like the development in Williamsburg that you shared earlier this week.
Yeah. So maybe this would be a good time to share a presentation that couple of slides from a presentation I put together, if you guys don't mind.
Sure. I'd love that.
Suki,
Both disabled
I found the
per-
25%
Oh,
provision in
okay.
the zoning resolution. I can,
Where is that?
it is, if in the residential district regulations, it's in Article 2362. So 2362 M, solar energy systems, sub number 2.
Okay, Let's see.
And now you're all getting a peek into what my daily job looks like. Reading off arcane sections of the zoning resolution or researching the zoning resolution.
Okay, so permitted obstructions.
Yep.
Okay, so
Item 2 says on the roof of a building greater than 4 feet in height, as measured from the maximum height limit or the finished level of the roof, whichever is higher, provided that all such portions portions above 4 feet are set back at least 6 feet from the street wall. That's in recognition of the FDNY landing space, limited to a lot coverage not greater than 25% of the lot coverage of the roof and do not exceed a couple other conditions. So that's where the 25% is.
oh, that's really interesting because it's like in direct contradiction to 2312.
Let me go to 2312.
Where it's talking about accessory power systems, including but not limited to generators, solar energy systems, fuel cells, batteries, and other energy storage systems. I mean, I guess the rule is usually that the stricter rule
Yeah.
prevails,
Yeah.
but they should definitely clean that up because I actually think 2312 is sensible. Like if I wouldn't want.
But that's
it to-
open space, not roof coverage.
Yeah, see, 2312 talks about open space, which to me makes sense, right? Like if you have no open space and you need for the roof to be your open space, don't cover it with other stuff. But if you have a full backyard like I do, like who cares what you do with your roof, right?
There's actually very few situations where your open space can qualify as only if the rooftop it needs to be a height factor building, not a quality housing building, which is one
Right.
condition.
Right.
And the open space has to be accessible to the tenant, or the roof space has to be
Has
accessible
to
to
be
the tenants.
accessible to the tenants.
Then it can be then it can qualify as
Right.
open space.
Right.
So I don't. Again, the zoning
So,
resolution is arcane. And
No, I totally see what you're saying, and it just seems like it's even internally contradictory. I definitely think that needs to be cleaned up.
But I think for purposes of this
Yeah.
text amendment, I think it does make sense to do away with that 25% because that 25% is really at odds with many of the other goals that the city is trying to achieve with its carbon neutrality, with a more resilient grid, with a lower carbon footprint. So I think that's I'm actually really curious to hear anybody else on this call if you have other considerations. I'm joining this because I want to hear what other people think. I want to be able to add my day-to-day experience as a professional that tries to design these systems and tries to make sustainable, healthy, affordable buildings. So I'm here to help.
You know what? I'll email you about this later, but it's looking to me like 2362 was amended in 2016, 2312 was amended in 2021. Doesn't tell us which parts of it were amended when, but
There's a history tab off to the right-hand
oh,
side.
okay.
You can
So
go
we
back and
can
look.
go and see.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can look at prior versions.
But anybody else have any comments on this issue of the usage of rooftop space? Nicholas, Esteban?
Let's do it. The more the merrier.
Esteban?
I'm trying to sort of gauge there's a big difference between how this plays out in a home in a landmark district than in a residential building. And so I think there's considerations there that will probably be different. I can't really I can sympathize, but I can't really relate to the plight of the homeowner.
So I
necessarily.
think if I could answer that concern, which I think is a good concern. Let's say you're not in a landmark district and this 25% amendments or 25% limitation is waived and it becomes 100% or whatever it ends up being. If you are not in a landmark district, you have flexibility. Then you don't have to comply with that 25%. If you are in a landmark district, then you still need to go before the Landmarks Preservation Commission So there's kind of like a backstop. If you are concerned about seeing solar panels in a landmark district, then the
Oh,
landmarks preservation.
I'm actually
Okay.
not. So that's not really like a consideration. Although I know that there are people who are, and
Right.
and you know the landmarks. I mean, you're going to have onerous regulatory things to deal with if you purchase a home in a landmark district. That's just kind of goes with the territory. So I think in terms of anything that can facilitate more solar in multifamily residential, I think is a good thing. I don't see why that.
So maybe I should bring up, this is something that one of the commissioners brought up during the presentation to city planning. But she was saying, well, I could see a situation where the landlords are going to want to gravitate towards energy storage systems or solar panels that would save them money, that would make them money. But maybe that takes away from recreational uses. And this actually was a practical issue for some tenants on my block, that they really don't. We have quite a few of these buildings in our district that have very little open space because they're pre-code, and they started wanting to go up on their rooftops and put plants or whatever it is that they do, put chairs or something. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, as it is, there's no regulation that requires that that space be used as like mine, for example. We used to use it that way, and then the landlord just decided, I'm not going to let you do that anymore. So now we don't have access to it, and we have significant electricity deficiencies in the entire building. Like, so to me, there's unless you're talking about like a post gentrification building where a majority of the people are like young professionals and they like fix up the roof as an amenity, then that's probably a little different, but that's not the majority of buildings in the neighborhood yet anyway. The majority of buildings in the neighborhood don't have access to their roof, or their roofs are being used for, like I said at the last meeting, are being used for cell phone towers that are like essentially destroying the units right below them. Like that's most of what I've seen in this part of Brooklyn anyway. So yeah, I mean, if the options are put solar, which is going to require them to actually upgrade the entire electrical system of the building, as opposed to just not having access to it. Obviously, like, something is better than nothing there. But it could be that in PLG that's a little bit different. Like if you're saying that's kind of what's happening in buildings there, then that might be different than at least in my area. And just so folks know, I'm on Franklin and Carroll, so I'm like a lot of rent stabilized buildings up and down the avenue here. So yeah.
So just when you just speaking from experience, when you do the solar installation, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got to upgrade the entire building's infrastructure. That electricity really comes down and gets tied into your electrical panel, basically where it comes into the house or the building. So it doesn't mean a whole downstream change. So I just wanted to address that.
Yeah.
topic.
I mean, as it is, like each unit has like 15 amps. Like that's what we're dealing with right now in my building. So like I don't think you could actually or I don't know that you would want to try to do anything in terms of energy efficiency or solar without handling the fact that like you can run one thing during the summer in my building. So
I mean, this might, if your building is going to be looked at as a potential solar installation, it might prompt an upgrade to the electrical system.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That would be, I mean, before we'd want any money spent on anything, we'd want, to be able to do more than a 5,000 BTU AC for the entire summer. That would be ideal. So yeah, so I mean, I think this particular regulation is not as pertinent, I think, to the issues that we're dealing with, like at least at the multifamily residential building level. But I'm sure homeowners have a lot more to say on that.
Just quickly, Mia, Tom Thomas is trying to get onto the meeting. Can you email him an updated link?
Sure thing.
One
Thank
thing
you.
that that I've noticed with like new development is that, and with these new regulations, is they're trying to do away with the parking. And as I look at it, it would be better to not exclude parking, to include even more parking and put solar roofs on the new buildings and then put EV in the basement of all the buildings. Like that's what I'm hoping they'll do at this new development on the corner that's going to be a grocery store near my house. Is they have a lot of parking supposedly planned for that development. Is what I'd like to see is developments with solar on the roof, charging EVs, and then people in the neighborhood, like instead of like worrying about street parking, they could all be parked and plugging in, have a spot, like people from Ebbets, wherever, right next door. There's plenty of people here that could use those facilities for that and take cars off the street and make the air cleaner. Like that seems to be like very like lack of vision and forethought to remove parking from other new developments, and that's what I've seen happen.
There's a part of what you just said that is addressed by this zoning text change, which is to allow for charging stations to be located within residential districts, and not just limited to commercial districts. So that would allow for a much more broad application of these recharging stations, either in the public realm, which I know there are companies looking to do that. I think at the recent Lefferts Manor meeting, there was a presentation by somebody proposing to do that.
This is that's for on the street though, correct?
Yeah.
Well, so,
that would-
okay,
yeah.
let's
I'm
actually,
talking
maybe we
about
should talk
in
about
housing.
if you want to switch
New
to the
development.
parking, maybe we should talk about the code issues for that too. So John is right that under the code, electric vehicle charging stations are permitted only in C2, C6, and C8 districts, all of which are considered to be districts where you don't want uses to break the retail frontage. It's uses where you expect a lot of auto traffic. And so you don't want it in like sort of a walkable retail district, right? And so you can imagine that like, a Tesla supercharging station with a big transformer and like 10 docks or something is probably something you want at the BP gas station up at, Lincoln and Flatbush or something like that. But those single post charging stations, I think those, again, this is something where the code is turned into spaghetti. But there is actually, under accessory uses, electric vehicle charging stations are considered accessory to parking facilities, which means that you can just put them in parking garages, right? But the real limitation with these parking garages is only a certain percentage of those spaces can be rented out to non-residents, and they can only be rented out for like periods of a week, like weekly periods or monthly periods. You can't have someone just come in, charge for 3 hours and leave if they're not otherwise renting a space. And so that's something else I wanted to ask you guys about. Like, how would you feel about, like, let's say the parking garage at Patio Gardens or 626 Flatbush or something like that. Let's say, whatever, I don't know, maybe they have like 150 spaces or 200 spaces or however many spaces they have. It's a lot, right? How do you feel about a situation where, let's say, the entire thing has, every spot has a charger and every spot, is either, let's say, reserved for a robo-taxi fleet where they're coming and going and charging all the time, or maybe there are some spots that are for short-term use, right? Other people can come in and use them, but they're all coming and going. There's no restriction on who can rent out those spots, right? I mean, that's one potential scenario. We could all go in there and charge, but at the same time, it's also possible that they could reserve the entire thing for a robo-taxi fleet. So just, these are sort of things to think about. Versus now, I think there's there's no restriction on how many chargers you could put in other than I think, the grid or whatever. For people who are renting those spots long-term, but not for anybody to just come and go and charge. So what are your thoughts about that?
It's a lot to think about and very good points that I hadn't thought of.
But it's very confusing, right? Because charging stations are not allowed everywhere, but electric vehicle chargers are supposedly an accessory to parking facilities. So
Yeah,
I
I
don't know.
Yeah.
I will, but I'll make one note. Teresa, you said something about being in support of electric vehicle charging stations in these new developments in their parking facilities. There actually is a requirement. It's in the building code. I could read you off the section, but there is a requirement for, I think it's 20% of the parking spaces to have EV charging stations. Now there is a waiver that you can get for affordable housing to not do it, but anyway, there is a building code requirement to have
Right.
charging stations within those enclosed parking facilities.
And I think
That-
there's a
that-
new city council bill that asking for 40%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I think it would be helpful. I would definitely look into having that if I possibly could. And that's one of the things that we were looking into to put on the house too. And I could see like anybody in the apartments, maybe if there were a way to have these new developments when they get solar to somehow use that to lessen other people's electricity bills in the neighborhood. Other
There is something
apartment
called
buildings.
community-based solar or something like that, or community something solar that allows for people to kind of band together their solar capacity. I'm not quite sure how it works. I'm not sure how, complicated it is, but
We've
it
gotten
is-
some people to come into our meetings, sort of touting that,
Okay.
that light. I mean, it sounds interesting. I know that they looked at Ebbets Field as a potential place to have like a hub of some sort that would, that would work. With the idea being that, during brownouts, during power outages, then there would be something local to sort of feed out. But I don't know any of the details on it, but it did sound interesting.
Yeah, I think you have to have for those hubs, you have to have gas in them to charge them up too. Power hub.
Okay, so that brings us to the issue of larger scale battery energy storage on rooftops. So again, I read the code as really not having limits on battery storage apart from the height limits. I know, John, you are saying there's something different.
I'm not disagreeing with you on that. I know there is a lot of resistance from FDNY to do battery storage. And from a design perspective, that's the biggest hurdle, is getting FDNY to accept battery storage on site.
That article though said that they seem like shrugging their shoulders and saying, okay.
Oh, really? Okay.
So apparently they have an extensive set of code requirements. You are required to have a permit for these larger systems.
This is FDNY?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
The
they
article-
have their own set of code requirements that they put out in 2019. But then there's also the load requirements, right? These are 150 tons. So do you want to talk about that, Andrew? Sounds like something you're concerned about.
Yeah.
Andrew?
Maybe you
Okay.
can't.
So
It seems very heavy, like very heavy. For the batteries. Is there
Well-
anywhere, I don't know that much about the batteries. Is there anywhere else to store them other than the rooftops? Can they be stored underground? Or I guess because of the flooding, right? We talked about that before.
They could be placed underground. They could be placed right near the incoming electrical service so that it's a relatively easy way to circuit them. I think, at least in our neighborhood, we are not in a floodplain. We're one of the highest neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So we're not at risk for flooding, at least in the next, I don't know, 50 years. But with sea level change or sea
That's
level
for sea
rise,
level rise, not for
Yeah.
like cloudburst and local collection, which
Okay.
we talked about last time.
Mhm.
And there
Yeah,
is a
and-
map. There's a map that shows local depressions.
Yeah, so
Which-
Andrew,
There's
now that you're back on, do you want to speak to this load issue on rooftops with these
No, I mean, New York City has
Battery?
very clear dunnage requirements, like the amount of stuff that you can put on a roof, given live dead loads, snow loads, etc. So I think as long as it's within that, it shouldn't be a problem. The issue then would be retrofitting old buildings, like the article that you had shared earlier, which was so funny that it is what was it before? It was a
it was a gun
gunpowder
factory.
storage, and they're worried
Yeah, it was a
about
munitions factory.
yeah, gunpowder storage or something similar to that. But I think the thing that I would like to say, I'd like to say my piece is that it's lithium ion battery atop the building or in a vaulted cellar or in a mechanical enclosure somewhere else is, functionally similar to the safety and structure of the building's occupants as an EV charger array in the basement, That's my 2 cents on this matter. I think that as long as like the FDNY signs off on it and you have the allowed clearances, I don't oppose it in principle. I think that there should be more stipulations that the sourcing and the distribution of the electricity once it is stored should be locally, consumed instead of, kind of a black box. It's stored here, but it could be, servicing someone in Long Island, wherever Con Edison is servicing. But
So one thing that kind of bothered me with this building was they already had violations, right? They had already gotten some sort of violation from the buildings department for pieces of chunks of concrete falling off their facade. And so this brings up an issue that, I'm always kind of concerned about. And I mentioned a little bit in my email to some of you as to why we should have things in zoning code as well as fire code and building code and so on. And there's enforcement issues, right? I mean, we know with DOB that they don't have enough inspectors at the moment. A lot of projects get self-certified. So how confident are we that we would have enough checks that say the roof could support this kind of load, right? Would they, do they have to get a permit from the buildings department before they can do this? Does there have to be an inspection? Is it self-certified, or does it have to be inspected by someone from buildings?
So I think you're bringing up valid points, but I think there's answers to those. Maybe, I certainly can't answer them without doing a little bit of research. But this zoning change proposal is kind of a higher level than what the DOB process involves and the regulatory regimen to getting an installation like this done. So I think as a group, if you're going to come to a conclusion about whether to support these text amendments or not, maybe that's what the conversation should be about. It should be about the high level, is this acceptable or not, as opposed to getting into the weeds and having this discussion about the regulatory process for implementing something like this.
Well,
Does
so
that make
that was kind of my higher level point is, as I see it, one of the reasons among the reasons for having things in zoning code is to make it easier to enforce, right? We know that we only have so many building inspectors to go around and look at things. But with zoning, if you can't get the right, it's another level of permitting that you have to pass through, that if you can't get it, right, it's another level where somebody checks to see what is that dead load, what is, right, do you get the permit or not?
Let me clarify something that I think is important. The zoning resolution is about use and building form, height and setbacks, and density. It's not about life safety. It's not about structural loads. It's not about systems in a building. That's the building code. The building code is where you look for the regulations for, how wide the stairs should be, what the ratings of walls should be, what the limitations of floor plates are, how you go about filing and permitting a system like this. So
True, but until we have the confidence that the building inspectors are gonna
Yeah.
catch this, is it better to have a backstop? I guess.
That's the problem, is that, we don't have confidence in city or state agencies that are supposed to do enforcement. And so we have very few tools like Department of Buildings is a mess. Like you can literally bribe your way into pretty much anything in that place. Like it's a mess. We can't even like penetrate that scene as tenant advocates, because they're not interested in anything that we have to say. And so, I think unfortunately we have to deal with the reality of like these text amendments are going to be implemented very quickly, and it's going to leave us with a gap. And so I think that's part of where the resistance comes in from some sectors that are concerned that like just making things easier to build is going to just increase the problems that we already have with it's not zoning. I mean, it's not the building code that we're dealing with, but it all plays in, and it's all happening right now. So I mean, I do think that it's, we want to take a high level look at everything, but I don't think that we can necessarily just ignore the reality of what those agencies do and don't do right now, whether it's buildings or HPD or however you want to, or DHCR in the case of affordable housing too. Like those agencies are a mess, and we have to grapple with that at the same time, because it's now, it's not 10 years from now. So.
Yeah, so that particular application apparently did go before the community board in Williamsburg, and that was a chance for people to express their concerns about the building in general, as well as just about fire safety of these batteries. I'm not sure why it came before the board, because like I said, to me, it looks like they're as of right. But actually I did want send you guys the link to the zoning profile, because there was something I wanted to point out, which is that this building, which relates to, as you say, use, John, this is one of those buildings that has very, very high lot coverage. There's almost no open space, even though it's a residential building, a residential district. Possibly it's because it was a conversion, right? So, maybe this goes to that issue of what do we think is really a healthier use and a more suitable use in a residential district for a building rooftop where they have no open space. And, I don't know the answer to that.
There is another provision in this text amendment that talks about the height of the height of the permitted obstruction. Right now, it is limited to 15 feet. And in my experience, working on a couple projects that have tried to incorporate solar panels, that 15 feet is actually a real limitation when you start to factor in the ideal orientation of these solar panels is not flat, it's angled. And when you angle them, you have to get farther apart and they get higher. Then below that, and Andrew, are you a structural engineer? Is Andrew a structural engineer, or is he just knowledgeable in those ways?
I'm not connected to Zoom. Sorry. I urban planner / architect.
Okay, got it.
So, but I do mostly like public realm work,
okay.
not the
Okay.
specifics of installing solar panels.
Okay, so the solar panels, when they're tilted, they have a certain depth to them. Below that, you need the structure to support that. Below that, you need these kickers that, and this is if you're doing a trellis system, that's usually what kind of bumps up against this 15-foot height. And in addition to all of that, there is roof installation that as our buildings, and these are, I'm talking primarily new buildings, but if you do if you do a new roof on an existing building that you want to increase its insulation value, that insulation is going to get thicker. So you're capped at the top. The assembly has a certain depth, and the roof thickness, and my screen isn't big enough. I'm basically showing that there's a diminished height that occurs, and the FDNY also requires 9 foot of clearance below the solar panel structure and the roof surface. So this 15 foot of height is sometimes infeasible. So what another one of these text amendments or elements of the text amendment is to raise that 15 feet to 20 feet. And I think one of the things that everyone's been talking about here, the potential to have outdoor space. I think having outdoor space where you've got that increased height of the increased allowance for the height of the solar array would allow for potential one of these, like the solar array could become a trellis, a rooftop trellis.
Yeah, so
and you
I
could
think,
actually have,
yeah, I
Go ahead.
agree. I agree. I think in that respect, maybe we need to think of solar panels a little bit differently than say those giant battery packs or HVAC equipment or something that's not really compatible with recreation.
Right.
Although, you know, you wouldn't want to cover the whole roof with that, right? People still want to get some sun.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to recognize some of the other people on the meeting. Isaiah Piku.
No, don't mind me. I'm just a student doing an extra credit project. So I'm listening in on some of the subcommittee meetings for the month. So I'm just a fly in the wall. Don't mind me.
Oh, that's wonderful. What school are you at?
I'm at Medgrabbers.
Oh, that's
Oh, great.
fantastic. So you're right here in our district. And what are you studying?
Public administration. So this is specifically for my New York State and local government class. So this is
Okay,
as local
fantastic.
as local government
We're
gets.
so happy to have you with us. Nicholas Almanor. I see Nicholas. Nicholas. Okay, he's probably on 2 meetings or something. Okay, so now might be a good time for me to share my screen. Mia, can I share my screen?
Yes, I made you co-host. You should be able to
Okay.
share.
Thank you. Okay. So. Okay, so this is what I wanted to share with you guys. So on the left is a picture of a house in our neighborhood. I won't say exactly
Actually,
where it is.
we don't
I'm
see that.
sure you guys
I'm
will
s-
recognize it.
We just,
Suki.
it just says CB9, City of Yes. Like, we just
Oh,
see
you-
like the first page.
You don't see it?
No, we just see the first page of your,
Okay,
Did you
can you see
share
it
the right
now?
screen?
Yep, I mean, I'm on the, can you see it now?
no.
No, we just currently see the first page.
But
Maybe
even
you
in
have to
this,
scroll.
in the slide sorter, it doesn't look like there's photos in pages 2, 3, 4, or 5.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because
It
I can
just says
see it clearly. Can you see this?
It says get stuff built recommendations requiring your approval.
Oh, how odd. Okay, I'm gonna stop share. Let me try it again.
That sometimes fixes it.
Okay, here we go. All right, now can you see it?
Much
Yeah.
better.
Yeah, but
Okay.
it's small.
So on the left is a picture of a house in our district. I won't say where, but I'm sure some of you recognize this block. And there's a solar panel on the top. It's elevated and it's angled, like John was saying. What do you guys think about this?
That looks terrible. Sorry.
I don't care. I like it. It's like the more the merrier. I like them.
Nicholas, anybody? What do you think? Andrew?
I mean,
No,
it looks
absolutely
like
no
an alien
objection.
thing, but you know, people have those big things still left on their roofs, those big cups that were for
DirecTV or whatever all over the place.
True. I think I'm just used to seeing houses like solar on like kind of on the side of like a to where it seems like it blends in more and just looks weird in this particular building. I'm sure that's not how it looks everywhere.
Is this
so.
the north side of a street? Like the
It is
northern,
the north, it is the north side, yes.
so to get southern frontage, you know, I'm, you know, you gotta do what you gotta do.
I think life is a series of choices. And, you know, this owner chose to have something on their roof that maybe some people think are ugly, some people think is beautiful. I personally think it's, you know, it's beautiful in that it is reducing this person's carbon footprint.
Okay,
way to look at it.
so this, I don't know if you guys have a guess of how tall this is. My guess is it might be 10 feet at the highest point. And this is, as a matter of fact, in an R5 district, so it has a maximum height of 10 feet. But many of our homes are actually in R6 or R7 districts, so they would be able to go up to a height of 15 feet. I don't think it looks good, but this is not a landmark district. So there's no requirement that it be kind of hidden behind the parapet or anything like that. John,
Yeah,
I
but
don't know if,
you don't really see it when you're walking by. Like, I actually know whose roof this is. And you don't, I wouldn't even have noticed unless you stood way across the street or you really, really looked up there. You don't really see it. You have to look to see it. You know what I mean?
so sounds like there's, you know, maybe as John says, maybe some people think it looks terrible, some people think it's fine, some people are like, you know, what do you have to do?
It's
Should we
also like
make the
saying it looks
permitted
terrible
heights-
saying it looks terrible doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. I mean, I just visually it might not look great, but
Yeah.
but it's not like
I think
but
I
it's not
had
a
sort of-
landmark district, you know. That's the
I think
the
I had sort of
consideration.
the same reaction. Should we make
like that's unfortunate, but that's great, whatever.
should we make the permitted heights taller? That if this is 10 feet, I imagine it's 10 feet. Should we make the permitted heights taller?
Well, what about snow and wind and all those factors? You know, the higher you go up, the more chance there is for
Well,
issues.
again, all of those
Right.
things need to be calculated by professionals. I know there's suspicion that actually gets done, but I got to tell you, on my project, it's absolutely done. We calculate those things, and there's a lot of redundancy built into that. So,
Well, okay, to speak to the issue of neighborhood character, this is an R5 district, like I said, the typical homeowner district. We have a lot of R6 districts, but which are probably too high, but that's, you know, the different discussion for a different day. But, you know, for a typical homeowner district like this, should we make permitted heights taller than 10 feet above the roof in terms of the neighborhood character?
Yeah, if it works.
Anybody else have an opinion? Hi, Tom. Hi, Nicola. So now that you guys are on, we're looking at the rules for solar panels. What do you guys think when you see this picture? Tom, yeah. Tom, you need to unmute.
Sorry. We're thinking in terms of lower buildings, but when you get up into 4, 6, 8, 20-story buildings, people are looking down on these systems, and so the fence becomes rather irrelevant. If the viewpoint is above the roof infrastructure. But I mean, it can't hurt to have them contained. It can't hurt.
Oh, so you're talking about enclosing the You're talking about enclosing it.
I'm talking about rooftop energy systems, batteries, and other storage systems, generators, whatever it might be.
That they should be enclosed.
Yes, it can't hurt to enclose them, but they will be visible from taller buildings.
What do you think about the solar panel in the picture?
I'm not crazy about it, but as I suggested to you in my email, I believe solar panels in 15 years will be history. So
I'm curious why you say that.
because of nuclear fusion, at least in the United States. Anyway, that's a question. That's a big debate.
And Nicola, what do you think now that you're with us?
So we are suggesting, current ruling is a height of 10 feet above the adjoining grade, and we're saying we would like it to be higher. Is that what we're discussing?
Okay, so if the current rule is 10 feet, and this to me looks like it might be 8 or 10 feet, you know, what's your impression of this? Is it okay?
I don't particularly, it's not appealing to me visually. I haven't seen it, as Tara said, maybe it's more prominent at this angle. Maybe if I was on the block, I wouldn't notice it as much, but I'm trying to understand how making it even higher would improve the look.
Anybody else? Nicholas? Are you with us? Nicholas? Okay. Okay, so that's interesting. I'm going to show you the second slide that I have. Okay, this is a zoning map of the notorious 205 Parkside. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. So this is an example of a building which has extremely high, a pre-war building, extremely high lot coverage. It's 96% lot coverage. That wouldn't be allowed today for a new building, unless it's maybe one of those ZQA buildings. And so this kind of speaks to this issue of, you know, what do we do when there's not enough open space? How should the roofs be used? And so we were having this debate a little bit earlier. Tom, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that. You know, there's a thing of do we use it for recreation? Do we use it for green roofs? Should we fill it up with battery storage or heat pumps or cell towers or something else? You know, should there be any guidance in the code?
You know, there will be fines for not conforming to having battery storage, for instance, and that's how the cost of that is taken care of is a big issue. So the use of the rooftop it will not be entirely the building owner's choice.
What makes you say that? Why do we think that we're going to require people to have battery storage?
Well, that's what CPC is talking about.
When did they say that?
Well, they said it at the meeting on City of Yes that opened with the discussion of rooftop energy. And
I think maybe they're talking about local law 97.
That makes more sense. Local law 97 is something that is going to cap emissions for buildings and require buildings to assess their energy usage It may incentivize buildings to put batteries in the buildings, but it will also incentivize them to make their buildings more efficient.
So it currently, I think, does not apply as strictly to older rent stabilized buildings
Correct.
and
Yeah.
affordable housing. I think they're basically just required to make sure they like seal up the air gaps and stuff like that.
Yeah, make sure there's no leaks in the heating system and replace leaky windows. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a compliance path that allows that to.
yeah.
All
I think it's going to be a
Path.
much bigger problem for pre-war co-ops. I think they're going to get hit probably the hardest.
They may.
What about the, I believe there's a current restriction of 25% of the roof covered by solar. And they were talking about eliminating that.
Yep.
And allowing the whole roof space to be covered by solar.
Yeah, so John and I were kind of like debating that because there's some contradictory things in the code. One part of it doesn't seem to have any restriction, another part of it does. But you know, I'm not, why would they have that restriction even? That seems very strange to me.
It is strange.
Okay, so then just to get to the issue of these larger battery storage systems, right? I mean, there's battery storage that is for residential use, like, you know, you have your solar panels on the roof and you have battery storage to store some energy, you know, for use on cloudy days or something like that. And maybe it's a pretty small system. And then there's also something that is closer to utility scale. And one of the commissioners brought this up as well, so that one of the goals is to retire these dirty peaker plants. And so I shared an article with some of you, I know Teresa read it, that in the Bronx, they, as part of closing this peaker plant and replacing it with renewable energy, that they need to have battery storage and they need transformers. And so they wanted to place a transformer station in a mall in the Bronx. And the local residents objected because they felt that there could be health concerns. So Teresa, I don't know if you had any thoughts about that or.
Well, I know those peaker plants, they have to have a lot of gas on site to get them going. I don't know. It sounds, I'm glad I don't live in the Bronx.
Okay.
I mean, hopefully they can have solar up there and get rid of these, you know, when you have a power, you know, shortage, like what Esteban was talking about earlier, you want to be able to come, you need to get a lot of energy quickly in a short amount of time. And those peaker plants are like, they use gas. I just know this because my husband did this for work for a while. And you have to have this gas on site that's going to charge those plants up really quickly to get them going to maintain. It's usually during the summer when they have a higher need for electricity. So
is the argument that peaker plants are better for public health than solar? Because peaker plants are clearly bad for everybody, like respiratory illness and like everything.
The concern was about the siting of the transformer, the substation. That it was in a mall, basically. That's what.
And then they tend to blow up too. Remember, like during the heat waves, how they would explode.
Yeah, I mean the issue though is yeah, I mean they maybe could have found a better site than a mall, although I don't know where else. Like that's tricky because you know the benefit overall to the community is still going to be probably pretty significant, you know, phasing out of a peaker plant, but it may not be specifically for the people that are, you know, living and working around that mall. So I don't know.
Nicholas?
Yes. What I wanted to ask is that I thought the city of, yes, maybe that was misunderstanding, was more concentrating into the 5G, but I didn't realize we also cover in terms of energy and rooftop and solar. But the question is, does the CDSS cover something like called cogeneration, trigeneration, where, for example, you could have a cogen replacing your boiler that's going to be use a fuel like hydrogen, which is slowly coming into stream. But you could also start with your natural gas with a carbon capture at the end. With that, is the continuation of the flow of gas, because that cogen system will just simply replace your boiler, so you don't need to worry about what's going to be aesthetically. And usually those systems for residential are pretty small, and even smaller than some of these fossil fuel boilers. I know that those will help meet the requirement for Public Law 97. I've been in contact with people at King County that have been really turning most of their systems. They've been almost completely decarbonized and use some of those systems in order to try to use the stuff. Does the city have address this particular technology that's quickly coming into stream? As they produce, since New York City, the tri-state developed a huge program for wind turbines that's covering most of the area, starting from Long Island all the way to the site where they use the wind to produce hydrogen or to electrify everything.
Well, so I guess, you know, the New York Power Authority has agreed to replace all of these peaker plants with
Whoa.
I think Suki may be experiencing some internet issues. We'll give her a minute to get back.
So what do you think, Thomas, while we're waiting about the, do you go into more detail about what you think is going to happen with energy, with the nuclear fusion?
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Livermore Labs, but they recently achieved a net positive output from a nuclear fusion event.
I did hear about that. I did read about it.
I just heard from Sakichi, her computer died and she's going to be a couple more minutes. So, but she said we could move on to talk about, I think she said rain gardens. Does anyone know what she's referring to?
Yeah.
One of the other amendments for the zoning for zero urban is to expand tree pits and other DOT infrastructure, I believe.
Okay, yeah.
So I don't know. I see, you know, bioswales and tree pits as another good thing.
Yeah, it seems fairly non-controversial. Does anyone have strong opinions against that particular?
We talked about those in the Environmental Protection Committee last session, not this session, but the last one, there was a guy that Christian LeBeau that was coming to meetings and was really into the rain gardens and the bioswales, and it seems like a good thing. I mean, with we do have quite more flooding than you would imagine in our area, even where we are, which is a little bit up the hill. When those big storms have come, we've had flooding. Somebody in my neighborhood's a well-known artist and lost quite a big collection during one of those storms. Like, we've had sudden basement floodings all around the area. And I know in PLG and some of the little Flatbush areas, people had extensive flooding in basements, and people that have buildings that are next to some of the new developments are also experiencing flooding. So those are a big plus. You know, anything that we could deal with the rain that's going to come. We're supposed to be moving into becoming a tropical region in New York, right? So we've got to deal with the water somehow. So yeah, I think those are a plus. There's more around than you think too, because they're installing them. They were installing one like on a rain garden. You don't know that it's there. It's more like the maps aren't quite right either, that they have where they're supposed to be. They're not, because we went around and like looked at them, and you couldn't really see that they were there because they're like kind of underground.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what does that look like from the street? Like,
You don't really notice it's there sometimes. But I just don't like that new thing that they made over at Washington and Empire. Like, why wasn't that like some kind of rainwater garden swill? It's just like a big patch of concrete. I don't know.
It makes no
sometimes.
sense at all.
Yeah, like we do need more of that, you know. You don't really know they're there sometimes, though.
The question are those rain gardens is similar to what we call catch basin, because last year I experienced flooding in my basement and I had to install a sump pump to prevent the water from coming in there, because there was a time when the rain came out so hard, so quick, and the basement started to fill up. As a result, I have to go and get put a sump pump to keep the water from coming to the bottom of the door. So that I think we're getting more and more unusual rainstorm and weather events, and that's definitely the problem. That you are seeing the rain garden are underground, or is it the catch basin they have for runoff that are big enough so you could absorb the rain to come in at a very, very rate of at a very fast rate.
Kiki, are you back?
Yeah. Hey,
Okay.
everyone. Apologies. I had some technology problems. So the text amendment would, right now, developers are required to put in one street tree for every 25 feet of frontage along a new building. And I think the text amendment would allow them to do a rain garden instead. And I think we talked about it a little bit last time. How do we feel about that? Are we ready to give any kind of recommendation? You know, we don't have to give a recommendation if we don't feel strongly about something, but if we do, we can. Anybody?
Suki,
Yeah, Tom.
I would take the trees rather than making a swale out of a tree pit.
Yeah, I agree.
Because what happens is the water from the street has a lot of pollutants in it. And if you plant any even slightly sensitive plants in a tree pit, the water from the street will kill them. The trees will survive. The tree pit does not provide a whole lot of volume of water coming off the street. Large swales would be fine, but I don't think you get much out of a little indentation in a tree pit.
Anybody else have any comment? John, I know you build new buildings?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that every 25 feet, you've got to provide a street tree. On, I think, every single one of the projects that I've done, we've never been able to provide that full calculation on the 25 foot. So we always end up paying into the street tree fund. I do think that allowing for more distributed runoff, like having these bioswales, whether it's a tree pit or whether it's just a rain garden, a place for that water to get into and percolate into the ground, is a good thing if you're concerned about flooding and overburdening the DEP infrastructure. That's one of the biggest things that DEP is trying to deal with is this like huge surcharge of stormwater that comes into their system. Where as a designer, we have to incorporate detention tanks into our buildings. But we're still getting like backups and issues like that. So I think promoting this better soil infiltration of stormwater on a more distributed basis is a good thing. I know one of the biggest challenges with getting a street tree to survive in the first year is sufficient watering of it. And if you have water coming in from the curb, it's going to help that. It's going to help that tree survive.
John, what's the reason you haven't been able to put in the street trees? Not an interrogation. I'm just curious.
No, it's a very good question, and it's I have what I think is a good answer. There's building entrances, there's driveways, there's infrastructure on the street, whether it's fire departments, bus stops, things that are there already that you don't want to move or can't move, that just prohibit you from putting those street trees in that 25-foot spacing.
So the rain garden would be a more flexible kind of spacing, or not really?
It might be, but you're not going to put one. Well, I guess you could put one at like a building entrance where it might not normally be permitted. Maybe you could put one there where Con Ed wouldn't want you to have a street tree close to a Con Ed vault.
Okay.
So I don't see this being a thing that's negatively impacts the sidewalk experience, the urban fabric. So that's just my opinion.
Okay, good to know. Anybody else? I mean, I'll just say that the two comments that I've heard, plus and minus, are in favor of street trees. I think we are designated as one of the neighborhoods that's more of an urban heat island, and the trees do provide a significant amount of shade. I know that, for example, when I choose to walk to the hospital, I go on Winthrop because they have street trees in the summer as opposed to Clarkson. But on the negative side, definitely there are property owners who don't want to clean up the leaves, because that's an obligation that we have as well. So I think there's pluses and minuses. I think the amendment was to allow them to do the rain garden in cases where they couldn't otherwise do a street tree. So maybe it's just about some flexibility. Okay, so to get back to the peaker plant issue, I'm sorry I dropped off. But so I'm wondering whether they're talking about needing to build out more battery storage in connection with these peaker plants. And I'm kind of wondering whether, even though these peaker plants have limited land, it's not nothing. They're usually like anywhere between 1 and 3 acres. And I'm just kind of wondering, with new advances in battery technology, whether we might actually be able to fit all of the batteries that they need on site and not have to put them elsewhere. I'm not an expert in this kind of thing, but just, if we're sort of considering, should we have more of a distributed model where we have kind of these large-ish battery installations in many places throughout the city versus super large utility scale installations in a few half a dozen places in the city. Maybe that's a consideration. And, in land use terms, do we prefer to have, let's say, 70 smaller but still large installations throughout the city versus 6 utility scale installations in certain areas? Usually it's manufacturing neighborhoods, like we have Ravenswood in Astoria by the East River, in the Bronx, as Teresa mentioned, in I think there might be one in East Harlem, and there's one in Sunset Park. So there's a handful of locations where these peaker plants exist. Do we prefer to also have the batteries concentrated there, or should they be spread, let's say 70 sites throughout the city? What do people think?
I mean, they're primarily, the peaker plants are placed in places where people are not politically connected enough to be able to oppose them. So you're going to get the same issue that you get with people not wanting affordable housing in their neighborhood, which is, and I don't even know that regulation, or the text amendments can necessarily fix that, but certainly it would be useful, I think, to try to spread that out in a way that gives everybody some share of the burden. Because right now it's leaning incredibly heavily on Black and brown communities, immigrant communities, like Sunset Park. Like they get the absolute worst of it, and there should be enough to go around.
I completely agree with Esteban. That's, if you open the door for environmental inequity, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think that the more distributed these systems are, the better resiliency and redundancy, and I think it makes a better grid, a more resilient grid.
Yeah.
But that means that we've got to be all willing to put up with, a battery storage facility right next door, or within the community. If we're going to have this more distributed, everyone's kind of pulling their weight approach, then you got to be willing to put up with it.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. The
Yeah.
question, where is that energy coming from? Is it renewable energy from the wind turbine? Because there's a huge-
Well, so the peaker
Oh.
plants are being replaced with solar and wind. Some of
Okay.
it could be generated on site, some of it may be coming from upstate.
Oh, okay, because making a city using a lot of hydropower to really to do that. But I don't know if you guys know about the project that's being done by Equinor in New York Bay and all the way up to the South Fork, because they plan to really electrify the whole of the Rockaway using those wind farms. But the question is, will be the result of those electricity generated from the wind turbine that will need to be stored somewhere. But the other thing so far, even though storage technology is quickly evolving, even some of them not involving lithium, because right now most of the storage.
I'm having a really hard time hearing you, Nicholas.
Hold on a second. Let me switch over. Is this better?
Oh, that's so much
Hello?
better. Thank you.
Is it better?
That is so much better.
Okay, yeah,
Yes,
because I had you on the
much
Bluetooth.
better.
What I'm saying, unfortunately, that's one of the area I'm working into renewable energy. But I've been following quite a lot what's been happening in terms of the wind farm development within New York State. And the Rockaways is, I think they're going to put enough offshore wind turbine to almost electrify most of the Rockaways and all the stuff. So I'm saying, is it that electricity along with the hydroelectricity purchased from Quebec. That's going to be stored in those batteries. As far as any information from the CDRS document that I have that information.
So I think that might be in the document from the New York State Power Authority, which I sent to the group.
Yeah.
I think in terms of the City of Yes and land use and zoning questions, how would you feel about having, like not a utility scale, but a fairly large battery storage facility sited in your neighborhood? I mean, I can imagine like your block actually might, or the next block over from you might be that kind of a site. Maybe they'd pick like some parking lot over by Kings County and
Right.
put these there, right? So
That
how,
could be a possibility. My
how would
my
we-
approach is really when you come to the city,
right,
is to really move away from to have each building to be self-sufficient. And that's why I was talking about the cogen or trigen system, where each building using renewable, especially using green hydrogen. Or you could get started with methane, which is blended with hydrogen, where the particular building would be able to provide its own electricity, domestic hot water and air conditioning using trigen or cogen system. That, to me, that's the safest. Once we get a full scale distribution of hydrogen, yeah, that will probably solve a lot of, because you'll be completely decarbonized. Even if you're using methane, you could use something like olivine to catch the excess carbon dioxide coming out that can be reused in concrete or put back into the beverage, use it for the beverage industry, a lot of those things. So, but I think that's a better approach, where each building by itself produce their own electricity using trigen and cogen system. And that way you don't even have to worry about the large scale battery. But I think that large scale battery is not going to be, if they go that way, I have to look up what New York SERDA and New York Power Authority is doing, but I think they're pushing a lot for more wind, especially in the New York tri-state area than anything else. And that's probably why you're going to get your large scale battery.
okay, those are very interesting points, actually. We hadn't thought about hydrogen. So I guess another point is, should these battery type facilities be restricted to manufacturing and commercial areas? You know, right now, these
But
peaker plants are,
for me, I think that's what it should be. Because if, let's say, you build an hydrogen plant in the Rockaways, as you're getting a lot more wind in there, when you have enough wind, you could, along with that hydrogen plant, you could also have a battery facility. I think they should be restricted basically to the commercial and industrial areas.
anybody else? Anybody else want?
I mean, I agree with the statements John and Esteban, everyone has made. It does seem as if a distributed model would make sense. Will we get buy-in across the city when specific neighborhoods are now starting to be targeted? We'll see. I think we also have to get buy-in and input from the FDNY and other resources to make sure that they can deal with any issues when it comes to fires and other things that seem to be happening with the storage of some of these batteries. And what risks will neighborhoods be taking to, if this is now, if a large plant storing these devices is placed in their neighborhoods.
Anybody else have any comments?
I think we need to just research, right, more too, because tech is developing so quickly.
So what do we think about the issue of, these utility scale plants, right? These are not going to be rooftop things. These are like, hundreds of tons. So they're likely to be, probably on some lot somewhere. Maybe it's a vacant lot, maybe it's a parking lot. It's like oftentimes it's the peaker plants are all located in manufacturing areas, areas with commercial zoning. How do you guys feel about restricting it to manufacturing areas? Should it be allowed in a residential area? How would you feel about, even if it was enclosed, let's say it's perfectly enclosed, it looks like a white box, like a shipping container or something like that. And it meets fire code, but there's always a risk, even if it's small, that the thing explodes, right? Would you feel comfortable having it on your block or around the corner from you?
Yeah, I think we need it.
Compatible with a residential neighborhood?
I think needs to be more investigation from what we've been sent just this past week from the people regarding the LinkedIn sidewalks, like basically like storage facilities. There's a lot that I think we don't know, and dangers that may be ignored. So I honestly would vote no to have it in my neighborhood, but that's probably where it'll get placed anyway.
Assuming it was distributed. Because there are no peaker plants in District 9 right now.
Yeah, personally, like, I'm really on the fence about this and thinking about it a lot after reading the articles and everything today. And it sounds like it could be potentially very dangerous, to have a huge battery in your neighborhood.
One
We
of the
were
things
thinking
that-
about having.
Exactly. I think I agree with you, Tara. I think, as I said before, FDNY, we need a lot more information about the risks that would be taken on by having that type of facility in your neighborhood.
I also think that we're not starting from this is kind of like something that comes into the question of, having like a set percentage of density increase across the entire city. You're starting from the assumption that everybody's starting at an equal playing field, and it's not the case. Like Sunset Park should not be, they've done their share of risk and negative environmental impact. Like some of that has to be spread out first, if you want to actually be equitable about how you do this.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be more. I think it needs to be a little bit more nuanced than just like across the board. Because again, like you do something across the board, then whatever process there is for opposing it, that's where the magic is going to happen, and suddenly very wealthy neighborhoods that are more politically connected are going to be able to get out of their whatever commitments they may have made initially. So there's just something to think about, the how that gets implemented and how it has to be. You do have to have. I think that you have to have an eye out for equity in a more long term. What's happened in the past 10 or 20 years in a neighborhood, and do we ask the people that are already dealing with asthma and respiratory illness from a peaker plant to also now take the risk of having something blow up in their neighborhood? Like maybe they're not the ones that should do that right away. So.
Anybody else? Tom?
No, I agree that they will inevitably find their way into non-politically connected locations.
So my personal opinion, when it comes to these hot potatoes, if it's that dangerous, I don't think that we should do it at all. And if there is a small risk, but it's unpalatable to most people, I think we should probably try to site it in places that are far away from where people live.
Mhm.
Whether that is, a politically connected neighborhood or not, but we should be looking for those parts of the city that are really not close to where most people live.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else do we have to talk about? We talked about the parking. We talked about the solar roof. Okay, insulation. We didn't talk about insulation. So this is another of those things where it's already in the code that they can have up to add up to 8 inches on the exterior walls.
Mhm.
And it doesn't count against FAR. But there has to be like a certain R value or whatever. And we talked about it a little bit last time, that this is probably not something that, we want to encourage them to cover up all of our pre-war buildings, because this is something that definitely impacts long-term value. We've all seen those crazy stucco covered houses and passed on them, I think. And it can also be very damaging to the brickwork, even if it's a rental building. Is that something that should be, maybe, but on the other hand, maybe for an office building, that's got a glass and steel facade anyway, it's fine. Is that something that should be restricted to specific, like to those office districts? Is it fine the way it is? Do we just need to landmark everything? There's a number of different ways that we could handle our concerns about this. What do you guys think? Tom?
Yeah, in the place where I went to architecture school, Rensselaer, has a very strong program in developing solar energy in the materials themselves, shingles and such. So newer buildings, it would be very easy to make the entire building a solar panel. And if you're retrofitting an older building, you could use that type of material. Now, whether they are economically viable yet, I'm not sure, but they will be. I don't know. That's a building code kind of thing, I would think. I don't know if the zoning ordinance would say.
I think where it comes in is that it's a permitted obstruction to add up to 8 inches onto your wall thickness.
Well, no, I'm talking about materials that will
Oh,
be
okay. Yeah.
in place of the kind of materials that are on the facade now. But on older buildings, you could retrofit it with that kind of stuff so that the entire building generates electricity just from the facades. And
they're also
I don't know if 8
window
inches,
glass, right?
I assume 8 inches is enough.
So I actually went to this, I mentioned this last time, but I went to this like renewable energy fair in Park Slope. And they had a stand where they gave me a sample of really, really thin insulation. It's called aerogel. It's like probably a couple of centimeters thick. And it's meant for retrofits in older buildings. You put it inside, like, on top of your plaster or something underneath your drywall, or like if you're removing the plaster, you can put it between the brick and your drywall or whatever, but it's super, super thin, but it has a high R value. So that's like one thing that they were recommending for retrofits, as opposed to having to lose 6 inches or a foot of wall space with that big, thick, foam insulation.
And are you saying that that's a zoning consideration?
Well, in terms of zoning, I think it's whether you can get extra FAR, right? Whether it's a permitted obstruction, whether, like if you're already over your FAR, like my house is over its FAR, I wouldn't do that. And I wouldn't put something on the exterior wall, and I couldn't because it's landmarked. But if it was a non-landmarked building, right, maybe people, as opposed to losing interior space, they would want to put it on the outside of the wall.
Sorry, I had to step away to deal with some garbage. The wind just blew my recycling out into the street. Putting the insulation on the outside of the wall and being continuous is a much more effective and efficient way of doing that. You don't have something called thermal bridges. If you're only insulating on the inside, where your floors come in and meet your wall, there is a thermal bridge that's created. So it's much better to have the insulation on the outside. It also eliminates or diminishes the possibility of a dew point happening within your wall assembly and having condensation happen within your wall assembly. So I do think that having insulation on the outside of a building is a more effective way to do it. I'm curious about that material that you mentioned, Suki. What was it called?
Called aerogel.
Aerogel. Okay.
Apparently they use it a lot in Europe, but I got like a little piece. I'll bring it over to your house. I've got a little piece of it.
Did they mention how expensive it is?
I didn't ask. I don't know. I mean,
often those high-tech products cost more. And
yeah,
it's worth it. The old adage, they're worth what you pay for them, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of thinking, you know, I remember I looked at a house at one point that was covered with that bad stucco from the 70s, and it was brownstone, and asking how much it would cost to remove it, and it just was so expensive. And then they said once you removed it, it would be damaged underneath. So I don't know, maybe you have to weigh the cost of that versus how much it costs to insulate from the inside.
Aerogel is a NASA product, it says.
I don't know where it came from. You know, but they have like super insulating ceramics too. So I imagine that you know, it's possible. So I think we covered everything. So the next thing then is zoning for economic opportunity. Let me see what time it is.
Almost 9.
Yeah, so I think we won't talk about it too much. We'll just talk about, let's talk about the cabaret laws, because that's something where the city council has already passed a law to allow social dancing in all types of zones, but the zoning code hasn't changed. So I think there were people who felt kind of strongly about this. And, you know, this is an example of where, you know, the zoning is kind of like the backstop. This is where it comes to the community and people get to say what they think. You know, should we allow dancing in anywhere that a bar is allowed?
Well, I think there's dancing and then there's dancing. I think let's have dancing everywhere. Why not? And then I think some people are concerned with strip clubs, you know, like the lap dance kind of clothed dance clubs that are not, you know, about social dancing. That's what I've heard.
Anybody else? Nicola, I know you spoke about this before.
Trying to take myself off of mute. Yeah, I mean, the main concern is the fact that, you know, on a corner near you, you can have what was a little restaurant suddenly turning into basically a club with, and then they have the outdoor seating, and now you have noise, more people, just a whole different, environment on what used to be a
Velvet
quiet block.
Ropes.
Open
I
till 4
remember there was
a.m.
that, there was one like warehouse building on Empire near the park that was being used as a nightclub. And they had people lined up outside with velvet ropes.
Oh, yeah.
It was that.
But
kind
at least Empire's commercial. So you're saying, okay, and it's a commercial street. It's not the corner of Fenimore with a velvet rope. Because one of the restaurants on the corner of Flatbush decided that they're turning it into a club at night on the weekends.
Yeah.
So, on the surface, it sounds good, but just trying to read between the lines, what are we really signing ourselves up for?
Yeah, and I think the law is, even though we see the liquor license permits, whatever going through, and if legally every place is allowed to be open till 4, right? If they want. So, and I think Mayor Adams wants them open all night long. And I don't know, it's not just for our district. Like, we have to think about like they're going to open a casino in Coney Island. Like, what could happen? You have to think about the future.
Well, if you have a bar in a building that has residential above the bar, I don't think they'd be too happy about adding extra noise, extra people as a consequence of the dancing.
So that's a good point, actually. I guess I might be the only full board member on. Nicholas, I don't know if you remember this, but we did have a bar on like Lefferts and Flatbush that was at the bottom of one of the apartment buildings, one of the new apartment buildings, actually, on Lincoln Road. And they were getting tons of noise from the speakers. The tenants above were complaining. And those noise complaints did go through DEP. They did go through the NYPD. It ultimately came to the community board. They were able to work something out with the owner, but then they claimed that there was one woman who came claiming that it still was a problem for her. And what struck me was just how long this saga took to be resolved. I think it was like, almost a year from the time they started filing complaints. Right. And so I feel like this again goes to, and this was a place that was coming to us asking for a variance, a waiver to be able to do social dancing. It was that kind of place. And so it just again kind of struck me that, the issue with zoning versus other types of enforcement, that it's often very difficult and protracted to get this kind of nuisance enforcement. And the zoning is kind of a statement that, it's this kind of activity is just not in keeping with a residential environment. Maybe it's a little bit easier to enforce these things. So that's, it's interesting that you mentioned that.
There's also, an institute or a commercial business that's might be a bar and could then have dancing. There's nothing that the zoning resolution says that there can't be residential above that commercial use. So there is like an inherent overlap and permissiveness in the zoning resolution that allows for those two uses to be commingled. I don't think we want to rezone the entire city so that residential can't be located above commercial, but it is the noise considerations are a real one.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Esteban, Nicholas?
Does anybody want to live above a really noisy bar? You have to think about other people. Does anybody?
Well, a bar is one thing. Turning it into a club is something else.
Yeah, I think the quality of life is very bad.
Yeah, I actually, when I lived in Manhattan, did live above a restaurant, and it wasn't a bar and it wasn't a club, but they, you know, had people, they had a sidewalk cafe and they had people laughing and drinking until 11, 12 at night. And in the summer, it was expensive to run the air conditioning, so I kept my windows open at bedtime. And it's definitely something, it's definitely something you can hear. So, yeah.
Yeah, maybe keep them to commercial districts. Like on Empire, there's like, you know, there's more than one building that had a club over there. And they're very close to where I live, but I wasn't really affected, you know, by the noise. It's more the amount of cars that come in for those places when there's no parking.
So here's a question I have for the architects, actually. Is it easier? Is noise proofing, is soundproofing better with these kind of commercial buildings, these warehouse type buildings, than with the standard pre-war?
No, I would actually say a pre-war building might be more with its massiveness. It might deal with certain octave bands better. The lower, like the bass bands, are going to transmit more easily through that massiveness. So I don't think there's I don't think a vintage of a building. I don't think a manufacturing building will fare better or worse than a different building type.
So it's just more of an issue of being further away from residential than.
Yeah.
Well, a manufacturing building is not going to be too worried about sound transmission.
Right. Yeah, that's not even part of the building envelope consideration.
Well, I mean, definitely Williamsburg is where people think about going when they want to go, you know, to a club or certain types of parties, right? So, you know, but maybe not every manufacturing district wants that. Maybe it has to be district by district. Okay, so that actually, so John's point about there being mixed use actually brings me to the next point, which is a number of the amendments to zoning for zero carbon are talking about introducing more uses into commercial areas and possibly combining some of the commercial zones. And we only have small areas of manufacturing and non-residential, but we have a lot of mixed use where it's residential above a commercial overlay. And in fact, there's probably a higher density of residential in some of these mixed use corridors than in the all residential areas. And so I'm just wondering, you know, as I was kind of looking over the code, it is pretty obvious that there are more restrictions on certain types of activities in areas that are all residential versus areas that are mixed use. And I'm just kind of wondering, as we've you know, begun introducing more and more residential in these mixed use areas, whether we shouldn't be rethinking whether the mixed use areas deserve a little bit more protection too. You know, whether it's from excessive auto traffic, activities that generate excessive traffic. You know, I think, like, to go back to our earlier discussion, electric substations require a special permit in residential areas, but not in areas with a commercial overlay, even if they have a lot of residential. Same thing with these 5G towers. They require a special permit in the all residential areas. They don't require a special permit in an area that has a commercial overlay, even if there might be lots of people living there. So, you know, what do we think about that? Do we maintain the difference? Are there some activities that are more okay in these commercial overlay areas?
So I'm looking at Zola right now. I don't know if I can share a screen or not. but on the Zola website is a zoning and land use portal that
I'll
has a
give you
wealth.
sharing access now, if you'd like, John.
Okay, sure.
Okay, perfect.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Oh, maybe I got it now. Okay, I got it now. Okay. Okay, this is another look into my world. So here's the park, and here this isn't defined specifically to CB9, but these little red boxes here, those are what Suki referred to as a commercial overlay. So these typically happen along large thoroughfares like Church Avenue. There's one here on Clarkson. This is probably, this might be
Flatbush, Rogers, Nostrand,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So they really occur along these major thoroughfares, and then there's these large swaths of only residential. So these areas, Suki and I are like right in here on Rutland Road and Fenimore. Only residential can occur there. So if you zoom out and just kind of like keep in mind these little red boxes, it's actually, I don't know, it's a small portion of the district. I'm not exactly familiar with the extents of it, but so here's manufacturing over here. I'm not sure if this is in CB9 or not.
It is. It
Okay.
is.
And then this is a strictly commercial corridor. This is a C81, which usually has a residential equivalent, which does permit residential uses to occur within it. Along Utica. So this is just I guess a way for everyone to visualize that extent of commercial zoning versus residential zoning. So I would say, this is predominantly residential, with locations of permissiveness for commercial along these major thoroughfares.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I think of Flatbush, for example, we have these very, very big buildings like Patio Gardens and 626 Flatbush and 33 Lincoln. That actually was the building that we were talking about that had the bar that caused a problem for the tenants. So I'm just kind of throwing it out there as a general question before the next meeting. Whether we might want to, one of the suggestions that we might have for city planning is reviewing some of these exceptions that are made only for residential only, and whether we want to have a higher level of checks for some of our mixed use areas.
So let's take like this C23 district right here. This may not be answering your question, Suki, but I'll offer it as a way to promote the discussion. If you're going to do a purely residential building somewhere in this zone, in one of these tax lots, if you're going to do a purely residential building, it needs to comply with all of the zoning requirements within the residential portion of the zoning resolution. If you're going to do a commercial building and it's permitted in a C23 district that's here, it needs to comply with all the C23 commercial district regulations for that portion of the building. If you do a mixed use building, the residential portion of that mixed use building needs to comply with the residential requirements, and the commercial portion of the building needs to comply with all the commercial requirements. So the nature of a mixed use district does not necessarily mean it is more permissive. It's just a combination of the different regulations that would apply to those different uses. Now, that may not answer your question. It may not
Well-
bring any clarity to this, but
Okay, so let's take, for example, the 5G towers, because that's something where it's as of right in a commercial district, but not in a residential district. In a residential district, they have to get a special permit from the BSA.
Okay.
Because I know, like Teresa, committee has been looking at this a lot, right? Do they have, if it's a mixed use building, do they have to comply with the residential district regulations?
for the residential portion, yes. Meaning like, go ahead, sorry.
But if it's on the street, right? Because I think this actually came up that.
Oh, I see. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So it's specific to the 5G tower.
Yeah, because there's something in the zoning code that says communications equipment is subject to a special permit in a residential zone, but not in a commercial zone. Not
So
in any
because
of the districts.
The way this is again, the zoning resolution is Byzantine. There's some like fundamentals that don't necessarily seem intuitive, but if you're in a commercial district, then the commercial district regulations apply. So that permissiveness for the 5G towers would be applicable to a commercial overlay or a purely commercial district designation. So it's a more permissive as far as this 5G towers go when compared to a residential neighborhood.
Or like the electric substations, for instance.
Right. Yep. Yeah, anything that's in the commercial overlay just really brings into that district the commercial regulations. Don't ask me why there's overlays on top of residential districts. That I have no idea why.
Okay, so all right, so let's talk about next steps. I'm gonna send out a summary of everything that we've talked about. And we can decide if we're comfortable making any specific recommendations. I feel like we have gotten a little bit more clear about certain things. I think we probably can make some specific recommendations. And just like, I'm just kind of curious, like for those of you who got my email about the, why do we regulate with zoning? I'm just kind of curious if anybody had any reactions to that. Esteban, Nicola, I don't know if you saw my email. Because we're obviously dealing with, a whole bunch of different regulations here from different agencies. And so one of the points that I threw out in my email for discussion was, why should we have regulation in the zoning code in addition to these other agency regulations? I don't know if you guys had any reaction to that.
I think it's a really good question.
Was this, I don't think Esteban's on the call anymore. Was this one of the emails that you sent out today? Because I saw emails coming in, but
no, it was something I sent out. I think it might have been like March 2nd. It was quite a while ago. I'm sorry, I've sent out so many, but there's just really a lot of ground to cover.
I will say that to unravel the Byzantine overlapping, sometimes contradictory requirements from the Department of Buildings, the Housing Maintenance Code, the multiple dwelling law, the building code, the zoning so to tear it all down and restart would be just a Herculean task.
So I think that a couple of the things that I had mentioned, and I'm sure you guys can think of other things, is that when it's a zoning issue, right, when it requires a zoning approval, that means it has to go through the ULURP process. It comes before the community board. And other agencies don't necessarily have to do that, like DOT, for example. They might consult us as a courtesy, you know, on the bike lanes or the bike share placements or whatever, but there's no process that mandates any kind of community consultation. ULURP is one of the few processes that mandates a community consultation. You know, same thing with the 5G towers. We're not really consulted on that franchise contract. DOITT doesn't consult us on these things. But when there's that zoning issue that we can hang our hats on, it comes before us, right? So in terms of, you know, it being one of the few ways that we get community engagement and for the community to be able to weigh in on specific things that might be going on in our neck of the woods or whatever, I think it's important. And then the second thing, I think, were things that you alluded to, which is that really only zoning speaks to like what's the proper use of land. And then the final thing is, you know, it speaks to neighborhood character. You know, like I think there's lots of agency rules that deal with nuisance, but they're difficult to enforce. Sometimes it's difficult to define, right? Sometimes there might be aspects of neighborhood character that aren't specifically defined in the nuisance law, whatever. But zoning, you know, cares about neighborhood character, and other agency rules might deal in different ways with health and safety. So those were a couple of things that I thought of. You know, maybe those of you who are architects have other, you know, likes and dislikes about the zoning code.
The fact that there are spatial implications to the uses, I think places it within the zoning framework. And also, as you mentioned, it's the board's entree to participating in decisions made. And we only have that one avenue. So I wouldn't take anything out of it.
Anyone else? Okay, buddy. So I guess I'm guilty of not doing community concerns earlier. We have a number of community residents with us. Anything we haven't covered that anybody wants to bring up? Last call for community concerns, community residents. Do you have any issues you want to bring up? Okay, so can I get a motion to adjourn?
I motion to adjourn.
All right, second, anyone?
I would second, but I'm just a visitor here. I'm not sure if I
I
have
think
any
it would have to be
authority.
you. I think it would have to be you, Suki.
Oh, am I the only
Yeah.
one left? I can't see anymore now that I'm on my phone. Okay,
Yeah, no, it's only the two of us
okay.
on the subcommittee left.
so I second that. Thank you all so much for coming,
Good
and
night, everyone.
look out for my emails.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
Thanks,
you.
Suki.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Good night.